All right, guys, welcome back to Falcons Central Radio, part of the Pro Football Central Radio Network. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman, joined by my good friend Matt Karoly over at Rise Up Reader. Today, we are back to talk about the Atlanta Falcons, their Week 14 loss to the Green Bay Packers. We'll be talking about their upcoming Week 15 matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, and of course, we'll be answering all your mailbag questions on tonight's episode. So, Matt, welcome back. After another loss, it seems that the Falcons can't find a way to get out of the slide. But I think we knew going into this Packer game that it wasn't going to be an easy matchup going into Lambeau, a place where Aaron Rodgers had basically been undefeated going back a decade in the month of December. But I don't think we sort of expected the Falcons to come out as flat as they did and basically get blown out in this game. The final score was 34-20, but at a certain point it was 34-7, and those last couple of points were just more garbage points to sort of pad the total. But what were your thoughts watching that Week 14 matchup?
I mean, the start, I kind of disagree a little bit. I don't think they came out flat. I thought,
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. You're right.
After that first drive, I thought we might have a shootout on our hands here, and each team traded touchdowns, and then we get to the Falcons' second drive, and once again they're moving the ball down the field. They get to the Green Bay 21-yard line, and I guess the first play of that drive, I'm reminded there's an incomplete pass. No one was really open. Then they had a 2nd and 10 run play, which, again, seems to be a thing of Sark's that I think we've talked about on the show is kind of a little bit of a head scratcher as far as his insistence on running the ball, especially the way they've run the ball. Why continue to go to that well? But then that third down play was really the one that was the momentum killer. That was the one where Matt Ryan had that botched throw that just took them, out of field goal range, and they still attempted that 53-yarder. And Dan Quinn said on Monday that if there was one play he would like to have back, that would have been the one. He probably would have just punted it because he knew that going into the win like that, Bryant's range was from 48 yards. But from that point on, that's where all the momentum, all the wind in their sails was kind of taken out, and then it was just back to more of the same that we've seen the last couple of weeks, at least from an offensive standpoint, where just killing themselves with penalties. Penalties seem to be the theme in this one, rather than just like miscues. The one where it was the 5th drive, it was a 17-7 game. They still had a shot to get back in it, and Matt hooks up with Julio Jones on a perfect 32-yard dime down the left-hand sideline, but Wes Schweitzer was called for a hold, and that pretty much at that point, defeated the drive, and the Falcons were forced to punt there. So again, this team doesn't have trouble moving the ball, and that's why I keep saying that Sark isn't at the top of the list of problems. Because again, what are you going to do as far as an offensive lineman committing a hold on a play like that? I mean, that's no fault other than the player. And then maybe, if anything, you can point to Dan Quinn as a head coach, because, again, instilling discipline in this team, that's the head coach's one of their chief responsibilities. So for me, this is a team that's just playing bad football, and there's no one really to blame but the players. And then also, I think the onus falls on the head coach a little bit. But just another disappointing one. And again, we expected this one not to be easy. You mentioned Aaron Rodgers and Green Bay's record in December at home. I do think that week prior against the Cardinals, where they lost at home, was a fluke, and was much attributed to just Mike McCarthy not working out anymore there, and they needed a new voice to lead them. So as far as the end result, losing to them, I'm not disappointed, but just what I'm most disappointed in is just how they lost, and the mistakes and the way that they keep beating themselves instead of the other opponent necessarily beating them at times.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree. I think some of the criticism towards Sark is people go a little bit overboard with it, but it's not as if he's blameless for the team's issues.
No. But as far as where you put him at the top of problems that this team is having, where do you see him as?
I mean, probably the offensive line would be one, even though the offensive line wasn't
Played well. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't bad yesterday.
Well, that's why I said,
or 2 days ago.
Weeks past, you could say the offensive line. Another week, you could say it was miscues. This week, it was penalties. So it always seems to be something different.
Yeah, I mean, look, you've had games where Matt Ryan hasn't played well. I don't think this Green Bay game was one of his best of the year. You've had games where the running game was non-existent, although they've been better over the last month, at least functional when they've had the opportunities to run the football outside of those second and longs that you mentioned. The wide receivers dropped probably too many passes. You've had some turnovers. You've had up and down offensive line play. You've had up and down play calling. So it seems like
just
nothing,
bad football. It's just bad.
Nothing really works for the Falcons. I just think, I mean, you can make an argument that, Sark's probably not the number one, has never been the number one issue in any given game, but he's probably been consistently the second or third issue. And I think that sort of consistency of being in the conversation is sort of what is the question mark with him. And so, I mean, look, I have been very openly critical of Sark in the past. I've been less critical of him this season because I do think he has shown improvements. I feel like the offense has sort of, over this last 5 weeks, has sort of regressed back to what they were in 2017. I feel like this year's, in this sort of period of regression, I feel like the issues with, the whole notion of execution is much more legitimate, I think, this season in the last 5 weeks than it has been in the previous year when that was sort of the excuse for it. But, I mean, the bottom line is the offense has to perform better, or you're going to continue to see people being like, well, we know Matt Ryan's good. We know Julio Jones good. We thought Tevin Coleman was good, and then he stopped being good. And we thought the offensive line was good. And, the simple conclusion, and probably not always the correct one, is going to be, well, these things were good before Sark got here. Now they're bad or, inconsistent. So the catalyst must be Steve Sarkisian. And, if this team continues to lose, it's going to be hard to basically, for Dan Quinn and, assuming he does return next year, which I think he will, to basically come back and be like, because we've talked about this with the team sort of running it back. It's going to be hard to sort of justify that if the offense continues to stagnate as it has over the last 5 weeks for the next 3 weeks. So I think, for him to justify bringing Sark back, that's not going to sit particularly well. And I think, somebody's head's going to roll if the Falcons, finish the season with, 4 wins or 5 wins. I'm not very optimistic that 6 wins is in the cards right now. So I feel like, Sark is probably going to be at the top of that list of sort of, you can call him a scapegoat if you want, but if he loses a job, then it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, play devil's advocate here. Say the offense continued their hot trend that they did early in the season where they were losing shootouts because of the defense. What does that change from you as far as your opinions of this team? I mean, because we know the defense has issues. And I just think, with the offense struggling, and I think we talked about this last week, it's taking the attention off of what's the actual weakest point of this team, which I think continues to be the defense and continues to put the offense in a position where they have to be perfect drive after drive after drive in order to contend week after week.
I hear what you say, man, but I do feel like these last couple of games, it's not that the offense needs to be perfect. They just need to do something. Like, other than that first drive, they didn't really do anything for the rest of the game. And even the game was,
I don't agree with that. They haven't done anything because, again, they're continuing. If you look at all the efficiency metrics, aside from, and even points per drive, they're still up there towards the top 5 to 10 in this league, which again was the same thing as far as last year was concerned. I mean, this team is not having an issue moving the ball. As far as 3 and outs go, they're one of the best in the league in that metric. So it's just, again, holding calls on the offensive line at inopportune times, drops, turnovers. How is that on the play caller?
Well, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but like it's one of those things where it's like those efficiency metrics, sure, if you look at, the entire 13 game sample or 14 game sample, whatever we're up to now, yeah, they still look good because they were so good early in the season. But when you look at these last couple of games, they haven't been good in
No,
any
but
of those.
they match those numbers consistently. I mean, I even talked about it in that New Orleans game as far as plays per drive, yards per drive, the amount of 3 and outs they were having. It's just at the end of the day, the scoreboard didn't show that because they had those 3 turnovers in the red area. So for me, and again, we go back to the execution issues and not executing. And if that's supposed to be on the play caller, sure, I guess, but that is what I would define as a scapegoat, because I just think the players aren't playing well. And I don't know if it's because they've checked out, and Dan Quinn even mentioned it in his press conference. He's seeing that they're lacking focus. So again, I think more blame needs to be placed on the players for not playing well than it is on the individual play caller. And maybe, you try to bring in if you bring in a new play caller, I guess the only hope is he makes it somewhat easier. That, you have those wide open plays that Kyle Shanahan would scheme in 2016. But other than that, I don't see how a new play caller is going to change the execution issues.
Well, look, I agree with you there. I feel like the sort of the tendency of people to be like, we just, fire Sark and all of our problems go away, I think is naive. I agree with you. Execution has not been good. But at the same time, I don't feel like you can basically say, well, it's on the reason why the downturn is all on the players, or mostly on the players the last couple of weeks, and basically say Sark is blameless for any of the issues, but then at the same time give him the majority or a significant portion of the credit for the team's early season success. So I mean, to me, the issue here is really whether or not Sark can basically figure out a way to jumpstart this offense. And in my opinion, this is sort of what I was talking about throughout last year, which is I don't think this team has an identity. I think that's ultimately the problem. And when they start to struggle like they have over the last 5 games, there's nothing for them really to fall back on. There's no foundation. There's no, stability, or there's no anchor, all those sorts of things. And I think basically they're stuck in this situation like they were at various points last season, where they're just kind of throwing stuff at a wall and hoping something is going to stick. And I don't necessarily say that's all on Sark for that lack of identity, but certainly he's not blameless in that issue. I think a lot of that is due to Sark not really having a developed or refined offense coming out of college, in terms of something that he's been honing for 8 or 10 years or something like that. I think a lot of that is due to some of the team's personnel decisions, where they make some very confusing and contrasting personnel decisions that don't really fit with what they're trying to do offensively on the field. Like they've basically over the last 2 years gone with replacement level fullbacks, but they still continue to feature fullbacks heavily in the offense. For the first 8 weeks of the season, every game pretty much opened. The first play was Ricky Ortiz. They started every game in 21 personnel, Ricky Ortiz and Logan Paulson out there on the field, and presumably that's their identity. But in 3 out of the last 5 games, they've deactivated the fullback, and Ricky Ortiz has been a healthy scratch. And it just doesn't make any sense. And it's very clear that the team is sort of floundering. And again, I think you're right in terms of putting that all on Sark and saying he's the cause of all that. Is not necessarily fair, because I think a lot of that is a Dan Quinn issue, and he's the guy that controls the roster and all that sort of thing and makes the decisions at the top. But like I think at the end of the day, it's just going to be tough for Sark to sort of escape this issue if this offense doesn't start to click in these next 3 games.
Yeah, I mean, I think their identity, they wanted to be running the football. I mean, Dan Quinn talks about it quite a bit. You know, I think the foundation of their offense is their outside stretch zone run play, and they haven't been effectively able to run the football. So because of that, you know, they've been handcuffed at times. And I think, you know, a lot of that does have to do with some personnel mishaps. And I think as much as anything, you know, the personnel decisions that Dan Quinn and the staff has made the last couple of years, you know, do have something to do with this down year as far as, you know, neglecting the offensive line over the last couple of years and trying to patch it together through free agency. And then there's also issues on the defensive side of the ball, but which I'm sure we'll get to later, that they've, you know, neglected or you know, maybe over trusted some players. But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. They're lacking an identity there, but I think their identity was running the football to set up the play action pass and to have everything flow off of that. And Devontae Freeman's absence, I think, is a big part of that, just because, I mean, he's supposed to be the bell cow, whereas Tevin Coleman is the change of pace guy. And then obviously, you know, Ito Smith's a rookie who has shown flashes, but I don't think, you know, they're comfortable just, you know, giving him the keys and saying he's the bell cow. Now, maybe these last couple of games we'll see more of that, because, you know, one of the takeaways that I got too from the Green Bay game was, you know, their snap counts were kind of evenly split. So, you know, they seem to be trying some of the younger guys out more to evaluate them, which is good moving forward. But yeah, I think the lack of identity, you know, is something that is missing. But I think some of the personnel decisions has a lot to do with that.
I agree. You have any other thoughts on this Green Bay game before we move ahead and look at this Cardinals matchup?
I mean, I guess the only other thing that, you know, I did get one positive from the defense as far as, you know, they made some plays in the backfield, you know, 9.5 tackles for loss, which was a season high. And they had the 4 sacks, which tied their season high against the Giants. Now, I know the Packers went into it with 3 backup offensive linemen, but as we know, as Falcons fans, I mean, they haven't taken advantage of those matchups usually. So the fact that they finally did to a degree was nice to see. Some guys like Steven Means was in there playing the Shelby role and had two tackles for loss himself. So, you know, it wasn't much, because at times they showed little resistance against the Green Bay offense, but the fact that they were making some plays in the backfield, which they did very little of all season, is encouraging. And is encouraging moving forward in this matchup with the Cardinals, because of the fact that the Cardinals are basically playing 5 backup offensive linemen. So, you know, another opportunity for them to wreak some havoc and hopefully control the game there.
Yeah, I think, you know, obviously the difference between the Cardinals, or one major difference between the Cardinals and the Packers, is the quarterback. And if you can get a similar performance from this defensive line, being that disruptive group against the run, you know, they still got gashed a little bit by Green Bay, and that became a problem sort of late in the game with some missed tackles and whatnot. But, you know, this Cardinals offense, I think, based off of watching it the last couple of weeks, is very sort of conservative in terms of its approach. They're trying to run the football with David Johnson and then try to set up third and manageables for Josh Rosen, which they haven't had, you know, a lot of success converting this season. In terms of their third downs, they have, you know, you mentioned the offensive line injuries. They lost their number 2 wide receiver in Christian Kirk earlier this season. And so it's basically Larry Fitzgerald and their tight end Ricky Seals-Jones, and that's really about it as far as their weapons in the passing game. And you know, it's one of those things where this should be a Cardinals offense that this Falcons defense should be able to take care of business against and really wreak havoc against this lesser offensive line. But I do think this game is going to boil down to, can the Falcons offense score against a pretty good Cardinals defense? Because, you know, the way this offense has played the last couple of weeks, and given how this Cardinals defense, I think, is pretty solid at all 3 levels, and has been, you know, pretty good at rushing the quarterback, has been pretty good on third down this year. They're ninth best third down defense. They're sixth on ESPN's pressure rate metric. So they can get after the quarterback, and it's one of those things where if the Falcons, if they're not able to score more than 14 points, and based off of how they played the last couple of weeks, I would be at this point surprised if they can get more than 14 points at least early in the game against this Cardinals defense. Then this becomes a very winnable game for the Cardinals, and it's going to allow them to be able to stick with the run and not have to abandon David Johnson and put Josh Rosen into some less than favorable situations with our pass rushers being able to pin their ears back against a very lackluster offensive line. So we once again get back to what this team needs to do every single week, which is, they need to get out to a fast start. They did that last week, and then basically it turned into mush after that point. And so they just need to find a way to sustain that. And I think it's going to be tougher, arguably tougher to do against this Cardinals defense than it was this past week against the Packers. So we'll have to see how they sort of take care of business. But, these are two really bad teams at this point based off of how they're playing. Obviously, the Falcons should be much, much better than what they are, but they haven't played like it. And we'll see sort of who is the worst of the bad teams come Sunday.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the last couple of weeks, I'm all right with them losing to the Cowboys, especially after seeing how the Cowboys have played the last couple of weeks. I'm okay with them losing to the Saints. I'm okay losing to the Ravens. I'm okay losing to the Green Bay Packers. I'm even starting to be okay with them losing to the Browns. Now, obviously, I didn't like the effort that they showed in that game, but the Browns are showing that, with a new coaching staff, they got some talent, so they're not as bad as, maybe they were made out to be a couple weeks ago. But I am not okay if they lose to this Arizona Cardinals football team, and that's why I've been saying, I think you've even said it too on Twitter, that if they lose this game, people will be fired. And, if it's Sark, it's Sark. At that point, I think both coordinators should be fired. Someone needs to be fired because, again, I think this is their worst roster in football, the Arizona Cardinals. And, obviously their defense is underrated. When I looked at Football Outsiders and saw that they're the 9th ranked pass defense, I was kind of shocked by that. And then I went back and looked at their schedule and how they fared. I mean, they had the one game against the Chargers recently where they allowed 45 points. But other than that, I mean, they even held kind of Kansas City at bay in Kansas City several weeks back. So, yeah, I mean, this is a defense that can hold its own. And like you said, they're 6th in pressure rating in the league. So that's, obviously priority number one, and it's usually priority number one every week for the offense, is protect Matt Ryan. It looks like probably they're going to roll with Beatles and Sembrilo again on the right side. And I think another takeaway that I saw from Green Bay is they help those guys out at times. They seem to chip more and have more 5 and 6 man protection. So hopefully they continue to do that this week, because going up against Chandler Jones and Marcus Golden, those are, I mean, with Chandler Jones is one of the best pass rushers. Marcus Golden's no slouch either, though. So those guys up front, if they bring a similar performance that they did this past week, I think they'll be fine there. Again, it comes down to not making stupid mistakes and capitalizing on the drives when they do start scoring, because again, their red zone efficiency has been much improved this year. So when they get down there, they're usually finishing the drives off. It's just a matter of, getting down there and not backing themselves up or anything. So on offense, if they protect Matt Ryan, again, it all comes down to execution. But I think they can do enough in this game because, again, as far as from a defensive standpoint, I know the Falcons are arguably the worst defense in football, but there's not a lot on this offense as far from the Cardinals offense that really scares you, especially with how they've been using David Johnson this year. I mean, even with Byron Leftwich as the new coordinator, I've seen a lot of things from, on Twitter about them just running vanilla up the middle as far as their run game. So not a whole lot of diversity or trick plays that they have to worry about. So again, if they can bottle David Johnson up and have a performance like they did against Saquon Barkley, in that Giants game earlier in the year, and make Rosen beat you with the lack of weapons that they have, they should be all right in this game. But again, if they're not, someone's losing their job, and rightfully so.
Yeah. I think this Cardinals offense is not scary. As I said, if you could, they got to stop the run, which has been an issue this season. We've seen them do a great job against the running in certain games. It seems like in the games where we don't expect them to stop the run, they play well. And then in the games where we're like, oh, yeah, this is not going to be a major issue, then they get gashed. And so they have to stop the run. I think you're right. From what I've seen, this is a very vanilla, very boring Cardinals offense. Now, I say that, and then, all of a sudden, Byron Leftwich, has been holding a 10-year grudge against Atlanta for the Petrino thing, and decides to throw in some new wrinkles this week, and all of a sudden we have no idea what's happening. So I wouldn't put it past that. But I think, to me, as far as the defense goes, I think the biggest challenge is going to be Larry Fitzgerald. And I think the Falcons, if they're smart, is basically just have Trufant shadow Larry Fitzgerald this game. And, he's going to spend a lot of time in the slot, but I think that gives us an opportunity to see a lot more of Isaiah Oliver this week. And so, like, that to me should be their sort of trio of corners, which is, Brian Poole's great. There's nothing against Brian Poole. He has nothing really to prove at this point. And he'll get reps. But, that trio of Trufant playing in the slot, Alford on the outside, and Oliver on the outside, I think is the best strategy for this particular week, given that Larry Fitzgerald is their go-to receiver. And the last thing you want to see this Falcons defense show is to get into these sort of third and mid-range downs and then just have Larry Fitzgerald just cooking you, just converting them, in this dink and dunk offense, just working you down the field. And all of a sudden they're playing that sort of ball control type of offense that you've been talking about the last couple of weeks, which then puts more pressure on the offense, the Falcons offense, to then have to be, as you say, perfect and whatnot. And so you just get a recipe for disaster again. And then, you get the results that may come from that disaster, which is, people getting fired and whatnot. So I think the Falcons have an opportunity to win this game, but I've thought that for the last couple of weeks. So I'm definitely not going to take anything for granted this week against this Cardinals team.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that strategy. I thought Trufant this past week played well. I thought even in the Baltimore game, even though they weren't tested much through the air. So yeah, a third one against Larry Fitzgerald. Even though Larry's 35 years old at this point, if he can take on that challenge and shut him down, I mean, that's another great confidence booster for him to turn around what's been a substandard type year for Trufant. So, and then like you said, it'll allow them to experiment more with Oliver on the outside and Alfred on the outside. So yeah, that would be a great strategy. I don't know if I'm holding my breath for it, since it doesn't seem like that's been the way they want to deploy Trufant. But when you got a top corner like that, I just don't understand it sometimes, why they don't want to use him in certain scenarios like that. But yeah.
I mean, those are the decisions that we tend to question these coaches. Like if everything was going fine, we wouldn't question it. But when things
absolutely
aren't going fine,
and that's the thing too. We've said it before. Like they're not manufacturing a pass rush, so why not send more pressure? Now, there's a stat out there that when they do send blitzes and stuff, the passer rating against them is pretty bad, and maybe that's why they don't trust the guys in the back end. But that's fine. Okay, turn your attention away from that, but try something else, like we're suggesting here with having, your top cornerback shadow, the other team's only weapon, and take him out of the game plan and let them beat you with someone else. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, when things are going well, we tend to just say, oh yeah, whatever, fine, sure. But now when things aren't going well, this coaching staff doesn't seem to show a willingness to try different things to change it up.
Yeah, we've been down this path before, and we thought we had got rid of the coach that was the issue with.
Yeah,
and so
Yeah, I felt a lot of deja vu on Sunday, that's for sure, about certain aspects of this season resembling that 2013 campaign. So hopefully those are just incorrect feelings of deja vu, and it's not actually the real thing. But I guess time will tell.
Well, I mean, look, the offense will have some opportunities, and we'll say this against this Cardinals defense, who are good. Obviously, the offensive line has to hold up, and Ty Sambrailo going against Marcus Golden is not necessarily something I'm eagerly anticipating. But
again though, Kyler Fackrell was, I think, playing a similar level of football, if not better than Marcus Golden is this year. So the fact that again they helped them out, but I was somewhat encouraged by Sambrailo's performance. So I know the bar is not high, but I guess my biggest worry, and even though Jake's been the best offensive lineman, I'm obviously more worried about Chandler Jones and what he's going to do, because whether Jake's been playing well or not, Chandler Jones, like I said, is one of the best pass rushers in football. So I'm more worried about that matchup and what it presents than really Golden. But we'll see. Maybe I'll regret that statement next week.
I was going to say famous last words.
Yeah.
I think Golden's I think you're right. Sambrailo held his own. He did not necessarily. I can't come on here as I would want to and just trash him. So he held his own. I think Golden potentially, though, has with his bull rush, could give Sambrailo problems, because the main issue with Sambrailo is sort of strength and going up against power. He's not a very powerful sort of offensive lineman. So we'll see how that holds up. Obviously, hopefully, you hope the Falcons, chip and do whatever they can to sort of minimize whatever hurt that winds up being. But, we know Patrick Peterson's going to shadow Julio Jones, or one would think, if they don't, then I get why people are talking about Steve Wilkes getting fired. But, you put that guy on that guy. And so the Cardinals secondary has been beat up. They have the great Budda Baker. He's their slot corner, so he'll be going up against Sanu. But you have David Amerson as the other outside corner, and that's going to be a Calvin Ridley matchup. So if Calvin Ridley's going to break out of the slump that he's kind of been in the last couple of weeks, this is as great an opportunity for him to do so against a David Amerson matchup. So hopefully the Falcons will, sort of feature that as much as they can this week. And if they do, I think we will see this offense get back on track, because I don't think it's a coincidence that sort of Calvin Ridley sort of went into his shell, hit the rookie wall, whatever you want to say, and the Falcons offense started to struggle again, because I think we know that this offense is great when they can spread the ball around and to multiple playmakers, and it's a pick your poison type of offense, and it really hasn't been that the last couple of weeks. So hopefully we can get Ridley back involved, and he can do his thing, and that will sort of be the spark that this offense needs to at least look competent enough to beat the Cardinals. I'm not expecting – I don't need them to drop 30 – or I hope we don't need to drop 30 against this Cardinals team in order to win it. But, if we can get into the 20s, that will be positive progress for this team heading into this divisional stretch at the end.
And I do – one last point before we move on to the mailbag. I do think Ridley is probably the most important player on the offense this week, just because Hooper's likely not going to play, if I had to guess, due to that knee injury. And so, as far as the underneath stuff and Matt Ryan's safety blanket, he's going to have to turn to Mohamed Sanu. But like you said, Budda's going to be on him, and Budda's a good player, so I wouldn't be surprised if he's able to lock down Sanu. So at that point, you're looking at where's Ryan going to go for his most favorable matchup, and it's got to be Ridley versus Amerson. So, yeah, I think if Ridley, again, continues to show the symptoms of the rookie wall and doesn't have a good game, I think that spells trouble as far as where Matt Ryan goes with the football, unless Julio Jones has one of those games like back in, I guess it was 2014 when he went against Patrick Peterson and had 189 yards. So if he can pull another one of those out, they'll be all right. But if not, and Ridley's not doing anything either, you tend to get worried at that point, because where does Matt Ryan go with the football?
Yeah, I think those are all great points. You're right. Julio has historically, dating back to his days at Alabama and Peterson's days at LSU, had always risen to the occasion against Patrick Peterson. It's a sort of a personal challenge to prove that
I think the last matchup though, Patrick. I mean, he didn't like shut him out or anything, but Julio might have only had like 70 yards. I want to say something like that.
I think if you were giving it a win-loss, I think you would have said Peterson won that matchup.
Yeah. So I mean, you're right though. Historically, I think Julio's got him more times than Patrick's got Julio. So hopefully that trend continues because like I said, if Ridley continues to have another slow game, it might be tough sledding for this offense.
Yeah,
especially if they can't run the football. Again, the defense of the Cardinals isn't the greatest at stopping the run. And if we get a similar performance like this past week against Packers, then maybe they'll be all right. But I'm not counting on that necessarily.
Yeah, I mean the larger point is like, given sort of the history of Julio versus Peterson, I don't want it to have to come down to Julio having to have this superhuman performance against arguably one of the best cornerbacks in the league, and has been arguably the best cornerback in the league for like the last 3 or 4 years. And I don't want to have to rely on this running game to have to sort of carry the offense, particularly given some of the issues we've had with the blocking. And then that puts even more pressure on, you need guys like Zane Beadles and Ty Sambrailo to play well, which again, it's just one of those things. So I agree with you. Ridley definitely needs to step up. This is a do or die sort of game for him. If he can do that, and he should have the matchup to do so. We'll have to see what it results in.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a prediction before we jump into the mailbag? Do you want to predict it, or you don't want to jinx it?
I mean, I'm going to predict the Falcons win because, again, I don't know. Peering into the future a little bit, I don't see anyone getting fired. I hope I don't have to see anyone get fired right now. So I think they'll take care of business, and hopefully even the players recognize that they might be costing their coaches some jobs if they don't take care of, one of the weaker teams in football. So I'm not going to say a score, but I do think somehow, some way, Falcons win this game.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a relatively low-scoring game. I think it's going to be something like 20-13 or something like that. But I do think the Falcons. If I'm predicting, I do think the Falcons will win it. But I'm not necessarily super like. Basically, this entire season, pretty much, I looked at this game and thought, oh yeah, this will be an easy win. And back when Sam Bradford was the quarterback, it's like, oh yeah. But they'll probably have Josh Rosen playing by that point, and then like I was a big fan of Rosen coming out, but like he's not fixing this Cardinals team, as you say, with their roster and all the injuries they've had, and the coaching changes and all that sort of thing. So pretty much this entire back half of the season, I've sort of like, oh yeah, this automatic win, and it's really the question of sort of what other games do the Falcons win. But now that we're here, I'm like, it's not automatic anymore. That's just sort of how far the Falcons have fallen.
I mean, the way I've been approaching the last couple of weeks, just based on the opponent, was, usually I get stressed out when I'm watching them on Sundays, but the last couple of weeks that hasn't really been the case, just because, judging based off the opponent, and knowing what to expect, I was like, they're most likely going to lose, but with this one, I just feel like, I feel like it's going to be another stressful Sunday, just because I feel like there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot riding on it, as we've said here. And I hope it doesn't come to that. And I hope they prove that they're not as bad of a football team, and they've just gone through some spells here. And hopefully they can flex their muscles a little bit. But like you, it's hard to expect a lot from them until we see it. And we haven't seen it for several weeks. So, again, expect a stressful one, people, and hopefully, I know a lot of people are pushing for the tank and get as high of a pick as possible, but I just think if they lose this one, they should be very worried about the future of this team and where this roster stands and how talented it actually is.
Yeah, I agree. We got a question about the tank later on, so we'll get to that one. But LAX Nedrick asks, Ryan is playing like a top 5 to 8 quarterback, and the Falcons have only 4 wins. That's terrible. Even with injuries, how badly did we misjudge how good this roster is? Also, in a hypothetical world where DQ is fired, who is your ideal head coach candidate?
Yeah, I think this is a great point, and I kind of touched on it earlier. I think this season's pitfalls have as much to do with, you know, the guys at the top of this organization misjudging certain aspects of this roster as anything else, as the injuries, as the play calling, all that. You know, we thought, I think, heading into the season, at least one of my biggest questions was, you know, can this defensive line that's turning the keys over to some of these younger draft picks, are they ready and are they up to the challenge of being the featured guy? Because, in years prior, we had Adrian Claiborne, we had Dontari Poe in 2017. We even had Dwight Freeney serving a pivotal role. So can the guys like Tack McKinley and Vic Beasley and Grady Jarrett, is that enough? And, it's proven that it hasn't been enough. And they overtrusted these guys, and they didn't do enough to add talent to that specific area of the roster. And then I think also on the offensive side of the ball, the offensive line, neglecting it ever since Dan Quinn's got here as far as the draft, only spending it on late day 3 players like Jake Rogers, Wes Schweitzer, and Sean Harlow, and kind of going the free agency route. Eventually, none of us wanted to admit it, myself included, but going that route, you got to think eventually that was going to crumble, and it crumbled a lot faster than we thought, I think, with guys taking a major step back. I mean, no one, I think, expected Ryan Schrader, who for the last several years has been an above average player, to kind of have just, a dramatic and swift regression. And then also, the guards not being up to snuff, and that maybe has a noticeable effect on Alex Mack's game because he hasn't played to the level that we've seen the last couple of years. So, yeah, I totally think they misjudged at least those 2 areas. And then also, it's just a combination of other guys not playing to the level that we're accustomed to on, the back end of the defense, like Devondre Campbell or the cornerbacks Trufant and Alford. So, it's a combination of both misjudging the roster and just, also misjudging the talent. I mean, thinking you have guys that are going to be ascending talents and are going to continue to take the next step, and they just didn't really do that. So, yeah, I think he's absolutely right. That's kind of what it boils down to. As far as the last part of the question, I haven't really thought of that too much. I did, since I saw the question earlier, I kind of got some thoughts or started looking around the league of what are the hot names. And I think if they were to move on with Dan Quinn in the future, I'd like to see them try an offensive minded guy. I think the last couple times it's been defensive oriented guys. Obviously they had Petrino for that not even full season, and he was the last offensive mind. But for the most part, Jim Mora, Mike Smith, and Dan Quinn have all been defensive guys. So I'd like to see them switch it up and go offensive mind, and then hopefully try to bring in, a defensive mastermind to just control that side of the ball, kind of like what Sean McVay did in LA with Wade Phillips. So, the 2 names that, come to mind, the one is obviously, I think it's hard not to be intrigued by Lincoln Riley and what he's done on the college side. I know that's probably going down treacherous waters, giving, a first-time guy like that the keys to your NFL franchise. And there is some worry, I think, if they were to do that. But, again, things, it's tough to put in words, but obviously, being the Falcons franchise and
What do you have to lose at this point, right?
Yeah, exactly, more or less. So why not try that? The other name is Eric Bieniemy from Kansas City. I think the Andy Reid coaching tree has been very fruitful. So going down that road again with a guy like Bieniemy, who again is just in his first year as the offense coordinator, he's not necessarily the play caller there, but he's been on that staff since 2013. And I think he's going to be a name that gets some head coaching interviews, maybe not necessarily get a job this year, but I mean, you've seen it with Matt Nagy being the latest guy, and then going back to like John Harbaugh, Ron Rivera, Doug Peterson. I mean, that coaching tree has been very good. So I'd consider a guy like Eric Bieniemy maybe, and maybe tap into what he has to offer. And again, it's not something that I've done a lot of homework on, but those two names I think come to mind. And again, I'd want to go in the offensive route if forced to choose.
Yeah, to answer the second question first, I haven't really thought about it. I probably won't really think about it, to be honest with you, even if it happens.
I know, say for some of the other head coaching vacancies that are out there, I'm sure, because you speculate on that, like the names that are going to be available in this next coaching carousel. Who do you think is one of the hotter names, one of the better candidates that you think might fill one of these vacancies that will actually happen?
Honestly, I don't know. Like I've heard the rumors of Mike McCarthy to Cleveland, and that seems to make some sense to me.
Yeah,
just because of the Dorsey connection. But it really hasn't been something I put too much, of my brain cells into thinking about who are going to be, sort of the hot coaching names. I do know that sort of the trend now is to get the hot offensive mind. But then when, a couple of weeks back when I was looking at sort of all the offensive coordinators that you would say like, oh, this guy's had a lot of success and he's ready to sort of make that step up. It seems like a lot of those guys have been hired in the last couple of years, in the last couple of cycles. So it seems like that group is a little depleted, and you're not going to, a guy like John DeFilippo was probably at the top of that list, but now that he's been fired by Minnesota, you wonder if that's going to make take a serious hit to his potential to get head coaching interviews and whatnot. So honestly, I just haven't really thought about who's going to be this next round of coaches really at all. So I don't really have a candidate. And I guess, I learned a long time ago that whoever I like is probably not a good candidate, because I remember in 2007, I was like, we got to hire Cam Cameron. And then the Dolphins hired him and they went 1-15. And so that after that point, I was just like, okay, I will never again speculate on who a team should hire, because I have clearly no sort of eye for this. So whoever a team hires seems good to me. That works for me.
Yeah.
Certain coaches, I'm like, like when I heard about the whole how Doug Peterson sort of left Kansas City, I was like, oh, he's going to be terrible in Philadelphia. And then 2 years later, he won a Super Bowl. So it's one of those things where I'm completely clueless about this stuff. So it's not really something I spend a lot of time thinking about. So if it happens, then obviously we'll start to talk about it. But until then, it's just not something I've spent too much energy thinking about. But to the first part of the question, yeah, I do think, what I will say in addition to sort of piggyback what you were saying, Matt, is I think this team clearly has a lot of really top shelf talent. I think they have some mid-shelf talent or mid-tier talent, whatever you want to call it, that I think some people, not necessarily me, but some people certainly, sort of talked about as being top shelf talent, and that didn't prove true this year. And I think there's, I just don't, I think you got Matt Ryan, you got Julio Jones, you got Devontae Freeman, maybe Jake Matthews is now in that group, Alex Mack, Grady Jarrett, Deion Jones, Keanu Neal, Trufant.
You're naming. I mean, are you about to say those guys are like the marquee players on the team? I mean,
yeah, that's what I will say.
Right.
And
so
then I think those are the guys that are good. I think for the most part, we knew those guys were good. I think the problem is that a lot of people, not necessarily myself, in some of these cases, thought other players were good that were on the same level as those guys, and they're not. They're just sort of solid to decent NFL starters.
Wouldn't you say though, like, not to cut you off, but wouldn't you say most NFL teams would love to have that many marquee players though at those particular positions? Like that's a great starting point. The rest of the guys have to be, capable depth guys and do their part. I think the only problem is, and maybe the more important positions, like you didn't mention any edge rushers there, and I think that's where you were going to get to that. people, and I'll put myself in that category. I said beginning of the season, I thought Vic Beasley, Tack McKinley could be 10+ sack guys on this team, and that hasn't been the case. And I think that's what you're saying is there was an expectation that those guys might take a step to being on that level as the guys you mentioned, previously. So, but again, I think the core is there. It's just there's certain positions and certain very important positions that they're lacking. I think edge rusher is number one, and I think Grady Jarrett's a great player, but and I think you've even made this point before. He's not a guy I think you can count on to necessarily just be the only guy that can wreck a game, and that's why I think getting a running mate and someone long term for him is very important. But yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to cut you off. So if that wasn't where you were going with that,
no,
please correct me. I mean,
that's kind of where I was going with. It's like I think Tack is still good. I just feel like people were like, oh, he had 6 sacks or 8 sacks or whatever he had as a rookie.
Yeah,
and he's going to have 12 sacks this year. And I'm like, if you actually go back and look at those sacks, like he was beating the Brent Qualies and the Greg Robinsons of the world for those sacks. So I think he has it in him, and we saw early in the season where he sort of was wrecking some people. But like I think he's probably a year away from being that guy because he's got to basically learn how to use his hands.
Yeah,
and that usually takes guys 3 years to learn how to do. And so that's part of the reason why I wasn't necessarily as high on the team's pass rush. I think you could throw names like Campbell. You've seen sort of regression from guys like Alford. I think people thought Oliver would come in and sort of be this huge difference maker. He didn't really live up to that. He's played well when he's had opportunities, but it's not as if he sort of completely solidified that group. And then obviously due to the injuries, you've had a lot of people get it sort of thrust into these prominent roles, and they just haven't lived up to it. Duke Riley was pretty awful. He was like Paul Warlow bad. You could argue that maybe Paul Warlow was better than Duke Riley in a lot of these games. So it's one of those things where a number of players that we sort of thought, I think part of it was like in 2017, one of the things that we were constantly talking about, oh, this is one of the deepest Falcons rosters that we've seen, ever. And then I think, with some of the offseason moves, losing guys like Poe, losing guys like Claiborne, in addition to, Toilolo, et cetera, not necessarily everybody that they lost was like a huge loss, but it sort of undermined the depth, and you didn't have as many sort of proven guys to come off the bench. Now, some guys have come off the bench and played really well, like DeMonte Casey, but then there's other guys like Duke Riley, et cetera, that just didn't really have it. And so I think the Falcons have a talented team. I certainly think they have definitely playoff talent. I sort of always sort of looked at the talk of like they're the most talented team in the league stuff. I never really bought that, but like they certainly have, I would say in the league, you ask, would other teams be envious? I think there's probably like 10 to 15 teams that are really talented, and there's like 10 to 15 teams that are halves, and then there's probably like a similar number of have-nots. And I think when you look at that group at the top, the Falcons are certainly in that group. I just don't know if they have the talent to say that they are at the top of that group, because I don't know if they have enough difference makers on defense, and I think they have too many sort of flaws at various points on their offense, or at least they have the talent, but you don't consistently see those guys perform up to their talent. So, yeah, I mean, I think basically, yeah, we all sort of misjudged how good this roster was, and when they get healthy, they'll be better. But they will, and we all know that they'll continue to address some of those holes on both sides of the ball this offseason, and that will help in a lot of ways, and we'll see how they go from there. Brian, at your homeboy Brian, has 2 questions. His first one is, would you guys rather win out and finish the season on a high note, or win maybe one more game and get a higher draft pick? In parentheses, he says, I just don't see us losing to the Cardinals at home. Again, Brian, just trying to jinx this team.
Well, I agree with Brian. I mean, I just can't see it. them losing this week, and I hope it doesn't happen because again, I can't repeat this sentiment enough. I mean, if they lose this week, I think people have to worry about the future. And again, what we talked about just the previous question. I mean, you have to really reconsider the health of this roster and where it stands and what needs to change. Because again, the Cardinals are legitimately one of the worst rosters in football. If the Falcons lose to them, what does it say about their talent on their roster? So as far as what I want to see them do the rest of the year, on one hand, I do want to see them win out just because then that would put some of those worries to rest that they're not as bad as, we think. And, they just went through a kind of a brutal stretch of the schedule that we didn't originally think was brutal, but now hindsight has shown us that they're playoff caliber teams that we just played and lost to. So on that hand, I want to see them win out, but on the same side, it would be pretty sweet if we got, a top 5 pick to add to the perceived talent of this team and really build up the defensive line and build up the offensive line and hope for some bounce back years from guys that'll still be around in 2019. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it. If they just win the Cardinals game and lose on the road to, Tampa and Carolina, you don't feel great about it, but at the same time, I wouldn't be totally shocked. And then at that point, 5-11, that should put you around the, borderline top 5 pick area. And at that point, you just hope for a reset, and hopefully 2019 is much kinder to them.
Yeah, for me, it's like when people act like, we'll see what the draft class winds up being, but when people act like there's a huge difference between pick 3 and 4, you got to lose so you can ensure that you get pick 3 or something like that. I don't really buy all that, but I would like to I would like to see them win this Cardinals game because I just don't want to have to deal with the potential ramifications that we've been talking about of them losing this game. But my main thing is I just want to see them be competitive. If they wind up losing games, on the final possession, then so be it. I've grown accustomed to seeing that this year. So it's not one of those things that the other team has the ball with 3 minutes left. Okay, this is a loss. That's fine. I can handle that. I just, seeing this team basically put together one good series in the first half of a game and then basically just have 3 and outs and 4 and outs and whatnot for the next 2 quarters, it's just not entertaining football. I hate wasting my Sundays sitting around for 3 hours watching the game, an hour pregame, then I do the various podcasts that takes another 2 or 3 hours after the game to sort of get that recorded and all that sort of stuff. So it's every Sunday, it winds up being 7 to 8 hours of my day is centered around the Falcons. And if they are terrible, then that's 7 or 8 hours of misery that I have to deal with. And so it's just one of those things. I just, I want them to be entertaining. This is a sport of entertainment. Entertain us. If you lose, so be it. I've been a Falcon fan for 25 years or 27 years. I can deal with losses. I'm mature enough to handle losses. So it's not that big a deal to me if they lose. It just entertain me. That's all I'm asking for at this point in time. So that's what I'm hoping for. If that means they win games, so be it. If that means they entertain me and lose, then so be it. I just don't make my Sundays miserable. That's all I'm asking for.
Are you saying that botched snap that hit Sanu wasn't comically entertaining? Because when I saw that, I'm just like, wow, that's just hilarious.
The only thing fun I had was when Deion Jones jumped on that guy. That was about it. That was the only thing that I thought was good about that game. The first drive was great, and then nothing after that point.
Yeah. So I'm with you, man. Yeah, you speak for all of us when that's concerned. That's for sure.
Brian's next question: which one do you think will be easier to fix in the offseason, our offensive line or defensive line? Is there any realistic chance Wes Schweitzer or Brandon Fusco will figure it out and be a good starter next year for the Falcons? or do we need to draft someone or free agency?
I think it's going to be easier to fix the defensive line because of the free agent class and the draft class. Although I'm not going to rule out that, the draft class for offensive line won't be good. I just think based on the names that we've kind of rattled off, and I will discuss in my next article, I think there's a lot of names, at least from the defensive end market is concerned. And then, there's a couple at D tackle. I don't think they're going to go that route there. I think hopefully they focus on that in the draft, and hopefully it's perhaps Ed Oliver, Quinnen Williams. So, with what they can get at defensive end and what they can get at D tackle and even defensive end in the draft, I think, it's going to be much easier. And, I'm less concerned there. I mean, I probably should be more concerned, but I do like the names that I've been seeing out there. And I think and hope that they just commit to that plan this offseason for once and invest heavily there. As far as the offensive line's concerned, I still think there's some question marks. I don't necessarily see them. I know we disagree on Brandon Fusco. I just don't see them parting ways. And I think you probably agree with that. I don't think you think they're going to part ways with him too after one season. Although, Torlolo, I think that was a shocking release because they signed him to a 3-year deal and then kind of parted ways with him after 1 year. So maybe we have another situation like that on our hands. So I still think he's going to be back. So he'll most likely be the right guard unless they, transition him, which I don't know if that would be the smartest move. So you kind of have that already in place. Right tackle, obviously they benched Schrader this past week, and, can they go back to him? Maybe. I mean, it might be a little uncomfortable. I don't know. I mean, Schrader said all the right things after the game, and he just has to work on his game and do the right things that they're telling him to do to get back there. So I don't know if it's necessarily a foregone conclusion that he's gone, especially since if they do release him, it's a $3.8 million dead cap. I mean, they could make it a post-June 1 cut, but at that point, what good is the cap space? Not a whole lot. So, really, you might just be looking at a scenario where they think, let's improve left guard and let's get that in the draft and call it a day. So that could be a likely scenario. And does that necessarily improve the offensive line? Probably not by a noticeable margin, especially if you're relying on a rookie at left guard. I mean, that's a lot to ask for. So that I'm more concerned about the offensive line and how they can improve that, unless really they just go heavy, in on the draft and maybe they surprise us and take Jonah Williams and think it's more of a problem than we think, or, well, we think it's a problem. It's just, I just never expected them to take a tackle in round 1. So we'll see. I mean, that's the route they can go, but yeah, I'm more concerned about the offensive line and how they're going to address those needs than I am the defensive line.
Yeah, I think you're right. The defensive line is definitely a major concern. But I think you're right, sort of given this draft class and sort of looking at some of the talent at the top of the draft. We're talking about not only in the top 5, but, in the top 50 to 75 picks, where the Falcons should have, at this rate, 3 picks. And typically that top 75 is where you get, most of the stars in the NFL are drafted in the first 75 or so picks. And obviously there are exceptions to that, but with 3 of those picks, I feel like we're reasonably confident the Falcons will at least get some quality players there. I think this free agent class also has some quality players available as well that the Falcons can certainly make significant. They should have little to no issue making significant gains in terms of boosting their rotation and finding quality, not only players in the draft that have long-term upside, but guys immediately in free agency that have sort of short-term upside that they can sort of address some of their issues. So I'm not too worried about the defensive line. Obviously this will be a topic of conversation for the ensuing months, and we'll certainly be revisiting this back in May over whether or not the Falcons have done enough this offseason to upgrade that D line. But I'm with you. I think the offensive line is a much more problematic spot to fix, because typically when you draft guys, rookie offensive line starters, unless they're taken at a certain point in the draft, for offensive tackles, it's usually in the top 20 picks, maybe in the top 25. And, for guards, since guards aren't really valued as highly as tackles, they're usually sort of in that sort of next tier in sort of in the top 50 or so. But typically, if you're not taking a tackle or a guard at that point in the draft, you're not really taking a guy more often than not that's going to be a guy that can come in day one and contribute for you. So, if you're taking a tackle in round 2 or round 3, that's almost always going to be a developmental guy. So he might come in and play, but he's going to struggle. If you're taking a guard sort of after round 3, I mean, there's always a couple of guys that sort of filter down into round 4 and whatnot. It could be functional starters as rookies, but the guy that jumps to mind for my eyes is like a guy like Joe Thuney back in 2015. But how much of his competence as a rookie starter was due to having Dante Scarnecchia as his position coach, as opposed to if he had got drafted by the Cardinals, would he have been terrible or something like that? So you can't really. The point of all of that, me saying, is I don't know if you can really count on the draft to really upgrade your offensive line. You're basically, if the Falcons are drafting offensive linemen, it's for future, because they have so many 30-plus-year-old guys, and they're going to need guys in 2020 and 2021 and whatnot. So if you're going to be aggressive at upgrading your offensive line, you probably have to do it with free agency. But we've sort of discussed, and Matt's mentioned sort of how that necessarily hasn't always worked out with some of these pickups, like a Brandon Fusco. I think you're right. I don't think Fusco's probably going to get cut. I think the only way he gets cut is if basically the Falcons are like, you know what, screw it. We're going to go all in and blitz this free agent and get the best offensive line that money can buy. And in order to facilitate that, we're just going to move on from Brandon Fusco and upgrade that spot. I have no idea who that free agent is right now, because I'm looking at this offensive line free agent crop, and it's like a handful of guys that I think are like good. And then there's a bunch of guys that I'm like, they're kind of on that same level as a Brandon Fusco. They're functional starters, but they're not necessarily guys that you would be like, oh, we signed this guy and he's going to come in, be a plug and play, fix for our issues. So I think the Falcons, I don't want to say they're screwed when it comes to the offensive line, but I think they're just kind of, sort of blowing it up. Like, I think you can make the argument that the Falcons can kind of blow up their defensive line and come away fine. I don't know if they can make that choice with the offensive line. And so that's why guys like Fusco and Garland and Schrader probably will be back again next season to at least compete for roles. And to wrap up, is there a realistic chance that Wes Schweitzer or Fusco can figure it out? Look, it typically takes offensive linemen 3 to 5 years to be good in the NFL. There are exceptions to that, but they're rare. And usually they involve guys that are sort of generational talents, like a Zach Martin or a David DeCastro or some of those guys that jump to mind. So I think there's a chance that Wes Schweitzer will improve next year. I'm not necessarily writing him off there, but in terms of him suddenly becoming good to the point where it's like, oh yeah, that wherever he's playing left guard, right guard, that's a non-issue moving forward. I wouldn't bet on that. I think Fusco can have a bounce back season, but given that Fusco has sort of yo-yoed between being a below average and at times poor starter, and a competent to above average starter, probably means he's not going to necessarily suddenly become good next season. So you're just kind of basically he's a stopgap at this point, is sort of what you're hoping. Maybe he exceeds those expectations, but long story short, I think I agree with you, Matt. I think it's going to be a lot easier to fix the defensive line in this offseason, and the Falcons are going to have a tough task in order to really, really fix this offensive line. And I think a lot of it's going to have to depend on current players that the Falcons wind up retaining and just playing better next season than they have this season.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be a slow rebuild on the offensive line. And that's why, again, if they do win a couple games and you're picking, maybe just inside the top 10, and depending on what they do in free agency, say they go out and get an Olivier Vernon and, potentially, I don't know, a Sheldon Richardson somehow, and they get both of those guys. Maybe they do take Jonah Williams and he's the plug and play at right tackle. And, again, like you said, rookie offensive linemen, they're going to take their lumps early on, and you're taking a guy like that more for the future rather than the present. But I think if there is an offensive lineman, and I haven't done a lot of homework on them, I think Jonah Williams is probably the most NFL ready that I've seen, where, he could, based on how Schrader's played this year, upgrade that spot.
Yeah.
Now, again, not saying a whole lot, but
yeah, that's fair.
That could help your offensive line in the immediate future, in the present. So maybe that's the way they go. Again, that for me, that goes back to that whole deja vu of 2014, and you see a guy like Clowney and you see a guy like Khalil Mack within your reach, true game breakers on the defensive side of the ball, and remembering how long it's been since the Falcons had someone like that, kind of like John Abraham is the last one that comes to mind. So getting a guy like that, it's hard to pass over the option of that just to make a marginal improvement on the offensive line. So I hope that that's not the route that they take, but if they do, I totally understand it. And again, it's not like Jake Matthews wasn't a satisfactory pick. I mean, he's now, you're seeing it in year 5. He's finally, hitting his mark and reaching the upper echelon of offensive linemen in the NFL. So long term, that would be a great pick. Just in the short term, you kind of would hope that defensive line is the way they go there. But yeah, I totally agree. I think it's going to be a slow burn to get this offensive line to where it needs to be, but they still got to commit to it, and with the mindset that in the future it's going to help them out moving forward.
Yeah, I like Jonah Williams. I think he's a similar prospect to what Jake Matthews.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
So I agree with you. I think if he's the pick, and basically, my thing is, I never expect the Falcons to take the player that I want them to take. That's basically been the history of this team since I've been paying attention to their draft picks, at least in the first round. Like, it's just one of those things where it's like, oh, I want this guy. They never draft him. I think Vic Beasley and maybe Matt Ryan.
Yeah, that's it for me.
Michael Vick are like the only guys that I was like, I want them to draft him, and they drafted him. And usually they go in another direction. Now, more often than not, that, or at least recently, has worked out in their favor, over the last 5 years plus. So it's not as if it's a bad thing. So basically this entire season, while everybody else is like Ed Oliver and Quinn Williams and Nick Bosa, who, are amazing players, and I would love to have them, I've just basically been assuming, because of the history, like, oh, we're just going to wind up Jonah Williams. So it's one of those things where it's just like, I just don't get my hopes up until, it's sort of merited. So, I think Jonah Williams, again, you said it, I think he would be a good long-term fit for this team. The problem is next year, J.J. Watt is on the schedule. Next year, Aaron Donald's on the schedule. Next year, who else do we have? Trying to think.
We got the NFC West and the AFC South. So,
yeah.
Is the Jacksonville Jaguars D-line still imposing to you?
Yeah. Calais Campbell's going to be imposing when he's 102 years old. So
fair.
You don't find too many 6'9", 330-pound dudes that can do what he can do. So So like, whoever the Falcons roll out there is going to have some tough matchups. So it's one of the, and especially if it's a rookie, don't expect that guy to do particularly well against some of those guys. So the hope is there's going to be some down games, and hopefully there'll be some good games. And, you just have to live with sort of the ups and downs of sort of a rookie potentially next year. So, we'll see how it works out. Our last question comes from Justin Sandu at Justin201224 on Twitter. He asks, put a percentage on the following people returning in 2019. He lists 7 people. Vic Beasley is 1, Robert Alford 2, Schrader 3, Brooks Reed 4, Dan Quinn 5, Steve Sarkisian 6, and Marquand Manuel 7. You want to go play person by person? Give our
Well, I wasn't going to put a percentage. I was going to kind of go least likely to be back, then all the way down to most likely to be back.
That's fair.
So least likely to be back. I'm going to put Robert Alford as least likely, which I know you probably expected maybe Vic Beasley to be at the top.
No, I didn't expect that. So that's fair.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to put Robert Alford as least likely to be back. I think they are kind of trying to transition, all the talk that Dan Quinn has about Isaiah Oliver seems to be he's happy with his progression. So I think they are at least going to roll with that plan in year 2 and kind of have Isaiah Oliver be the guy opposite Trufant. So I think Alford's least likely. Oh, wait. Actually, now I know why you thought that Alford wouldn't be least. Brooks Reed should probably be least likely, then Robert Alford. But yeah, I think Brooks Reed, from a contract standpoint, unless he's willing to restructure, and even then, I just think it's time. He got a 5-year deal. He got through 4 of them, which that's pretty good for Brooks Reed. So I just think they got to totally revamp this defensive line, and Brooks Reed is one of those guys that needs to go. So those 2 are at the top. I'd put Brooks Reed least, then Robert Alford. Then third, I'm probably going to put Vic Beasley there. It's interesting. Jeff Schultz had the article out last week on The Athletic, basically saying that he talked to a scout in the organization and basically made it seem like there's no chance he's going to be back. Then he writes an article this week that says maybe there's a chance he's back at a reduced rate as a role player, and he kind of cited how Beasley's come on a little bit the last couple weeks in reduced snaps, which it's hard to argue with some of that. So again, if you are going to bring Vic Beasley back, that's kind of what I've been saying the last several weeks, is as far as the Falcons need to place like 4.5 defensive linemen, with Vic Beasley serving as that half guy that's a situational nickel rusher that maybe can still serve a purpose. So again, it all comes down to I think the contract. If they can negotiate a term where maybe he's in the $6 million range, I know some people are going to say that's even still too much, but pass rushers are going to get paid, and Vic Beasley can still do it every now and then. So I think there's a chance there. I would still try to move on from him if it was me, but again, the Falcons sometimes make interesting personnel decisions, so we'll see what happens there. So I put him third. The next couple are tough. I think this is probably where one of the coordinators would fall. And again, a lot of that still for me will be determined these last couple games. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if either went, if they lose again to the Cardinals, like we've been saying. But I put Manuel first and then Sarkisian. I don't know if they're necessarily going to fire Marquand Manuel. I just think you might see a situation like you saw after 2016 where Dan Quinn just takes the reins back of the play calling. And, because 2019, I think there is going to be some pressure. I don't think there's any pressure for him to lose his job this year, after this year. But I think 2019, there's going to be some noticeable pressure. So at that point, Dan Quinn, I think, is going to be like, well, hey, if I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down calling the shots on defense, because that's my forte. So I think that's more likely. And then, obviously, I think Steve Sarkisian's next, and then I put Ryan Schrader. Again, I just think that cap hit plus the dead cap hit, plus the fact that, again, we've only seen one truly bad season from Ryan Schrader. Again, I guess you can make the same case for Robert Alford, but we've talked about how much more difficult it is to replace the offensive line and to revamp the offensive line. So I think they're going to still keep him around, like you said, to at least compete with a rookie or a free agent or whatever. Because again, that dead cap hit, the cap space that you would get from him wouldn't do you a whole lot of good. So I put him 6th, and then I don't think Dan Quinn's in trouble to lose his job after this year, so I'd put him last.
Yeah, I'll go in reverse order just to mix it up. But yeah, I think Dan Quinn is the safest out of these 7. I don't think there's a 0% chance that he gets fired, but I think it's probably in the single digits. But the one thing I will say is, like, if this team continues to embarrass Arthur Blank, he has a tendency to basically, like, he doesn't mess around when people embarrass him, and that's usually
do you think the Atlanta United championship helps things at all? The fact that he did win a championship, because that's what I've been thinking. That
you think it mellows him out a little bit, you know?
A little bit.
I mean, I think you can make a case for that, but like if the Falcons wind up like being up, 34-7 against Carolina and then blow that lead or something like that, then I don't think he's going to be very mellow at that point, So
yeah,
we'll see. Like I think, yeah, I just think the issue is going to be, if they wind up finishing 4-12 and they just look just terrible these last 3 games,
because people have made the points online, and I tend to agree with them about, if you're going to fire a coach after one bad season, after the successes you've had the previous 2 years, is that going to scare other head coaching candidates off to come here, where it's like you're pretty much pressured to have a good season, and if you don't, your time's a ticking then either the following year or maybe even after you become a one and done coach. And what coach wants to put them themselves in that position?
I think that's a fair point, but I do think, given other than maybe Green Bay because of Aaron Rodgers, I can't imagine a coach being like, yeah, I don't want to go to Atlanta where I have a franchise quarterback, I have one of the best receivers in the league, I have, all these weapons. Like, coaches dream of the opportunity where they can be put into a situation where they can be successful.
Fair.
And I think most coaches will look at that and say, how did the Falcons go from 4-4 to 4-12 or something like that? Like, that to me is the scenario where Dan Quinn gets fired, where they lose out, they go 0-8 and just basically are terrible these next 3 weeks, losing to Arizona, which basically is being terrible, and then getting waxed by Carolina and or Tampa Bay, and getting rolled by those teams like they've gotten rolled by Baltimore and Green Bay. And at that point, I don't think Dan Quinn is as safe as, like, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that he's going to keep his job. But I do think he will probably keep his job. I think, the low percentage, but with each mounting loss, I think that percentage goes up. And so, we'll see if we keep talking about this in the next couple of weeks. But he's the safest. I would probably say after him, I do think probably Schrader's probably the next person, but I don't think he's necessarily safe. I think his benching puts him on standby. And I think a lot of it kind of depends on how well Ty Sambrailo plays these last couple of games. If Sambrailo is decent, then I think the Falcons will basically eat that money and be like, well, literally a replacement level offensive tackle in Ty Sambrailo was better than him. So we're not too worried about him coming back. So, if he's second safest or sixth least likely to go, or whatever you want to rank it as, it's a distant one. He's not safe. That's the point I'm trying to make. So after that, I would probably go Vic Beasley. And just because, like, I don't see how this team, like, I don't see how the team can figure out a way to bring Vic Beasley back at a cheaper deal. Like, if I'm Vic Beasley's agent, I'm like, no, you can go suck it. Like, if I don't have to do, if I don't do anything, like, if you come to me with a restructure, your choices are either to cut me or just to eat it, because I just have to wait out till March 13th.
What leverage do you think the team has? Because there was those rumors around the deadline that teams inquired about Vic Beasley. Do you think the team has any leverage then at that point to?
I don't think they do. Like, I like, that's what I'm saying. Like, I think, he's owed what, like $13 million from the Falcons if they keep him. Like, I'm pretty sure Vic Beasley can get $13 million guaranteed on the open market, even if you're not, like, happy with him. Like that's a pretty easy number to hit, you know? So like that's basically like a $6.5 million deal average a year with the first 2 years guaranteed. So like if you're his agent, you're like, no, I'm not going to renegotiate. So either cut me or keep me. Those are your two options. So I just can't
And you don't
picture
see
this.
them cutting them then.
I mean, like that to me is the only choice. Is if they're inclined to like, to me, I think the Falcons are going to keep him because they're going to be like, well, there's that 15 and a half sack guy is in there somewhere.
Oh, geez, yeah.
So like I always like I'm always Mr. Negativity. So I
They'll
always
talk
just
themselves into it, huh?
yeah, I just always think the lowest of the team, and then they come in and surprise me, and then I'm like, oh, okay, they actually made the smart move. So I just set the bar really low.
Well,
so like.
Yeah.
I
After
don't
the
know
Derek Shelby contract thing, yeah, you might be right on some of their contract negotiating tactics. So
I think Beasley's pretty safe. I think you're right. The next group is either coordinator. At this point in time, I feel like Sark kind of has to go. I think Blank is just going to be like, dude, like, what are you doing? Like, you got to fire these guys, you know? And so I feel like, I think I think both Sark and Manuel have a chance to turn things around. Like, I think Manuel has a built-in injury excuse, but it's all dependent on the defense actually looking competent these next 3 weeks with Deion Jones back. I think if they actually look competent and not giving up 34 points to an Packers team with a first-time play caller, like they need to stop doing that,
And if he also stops those 3-man rushes on 3rd and long too, that would be a start in the right direction to help your chances. Because
he started doing it on 2nd down against Green Bay, so it was just like, come on, dude, stop.
Like why is Tack McKinley spying the underneath? Like why? So that's why for me it's just like.
I get it against like Josh Rosen or Lamar Jackson because they're rookies and they don't know what they're looking at. Like I get a 3-man rush against a rookie quarterback. Like I'm not going to kill a guy for like, oh, we're going to drop 8 guys in the coverage and clog the run lanes against a quarterback that can only read one read at a time. But against Aaron Rodgers, against Drew Brees, man, like come on now, you can't be doing this stuff. Like they're going to just pick that stuff apart. So I think, I don't know, between those two guys, I think they can both have an opportunity to salvage their jobs. But if the status quo that we have seen the last couple of weeks carries over these next 3 weeks, then I don't think either one of them is going to be back.
So do you don't think Manuel would like retain some other spot on the staff? Do you think that's even like an option as far as,
I mean, maybe. I don't know.
I can see that more likely. Like with Sark, he's gone, like he's out of the building. But with Manuel, I just think, like you said, he kind of has an excuse. He's, I said this on an earlier show. He's kind of like a puppet as far as, you're running Dan Quinn's scheme more or less. So I don't know how much that matters, but I can see Manuel like having, because again, I like what he brings as far as like he's cut from the same cloth as Dan Quinn, being a motivator, a player's kind of guy. So I can see that happening, but yeah, I mean, I guess that's an irrelevant point, but I think he still has a shot to maintain a position on the staff, whereas Sark, I think he's gone, and then you'd be looking at a scenario where Knapp takes over as the interim, and then in the future, who knows? Hopefully it's Kubiak, but I don't just.
Yeah, who knows at this point? I mean, that's basically the mantra. I have no idea what's going to happen. So, right. I think that's a fair point. I think you can realistically see Manuel going back to being a DB's coach, or them bringing in like a passing game coordinator, and him sort of retaining. Like, Dallas has the situation where Rod Marinelli is the defensive coordinator, but Chris Richards calling the defense.
Mm-hmm.
So I could see a situation where they hire someone to be like a passing game coordinator or something like that. I think they already
have that now, though.
Yeah, I think it's Jerome Henderson or something like that.
Yeah.
But like they could reshuffle it or something like that,
right.
and bring in somebody else to basically do the Greg Knapp thing and basically take over and sort of help him out there. So that does make sense.
Yeah.
So I think after that point, who I got left? Alford and Reid as the next.
Yeah.
I think Reid is. I won't say I think he's definitely going to get cut, but I do think there's a high probability that he's going to get the Derek Shelby deal and
Oh,
come back on
jeez.
a 1-year, $2 million deal or something like that. Because I think like we've seen Brooks Reed, that spin move, that pass rusher. I would have argued last year he was probably the team's 5th best pass rusher after Bo Claiborne, Tack, and Jarrett. I don't think he's that guy anymore, and I think that's clear to everybody. But he still gives you value against the run, and I think I could see the Falcons being like similar to Shelby, where it's like they cut him, they look at other options, they have sort of a 1-year cheap deal offer out there for him, and if he doesn't, find better options, and the Falcons don't find better options in free agency, he comes back in a similar capacity. So
yeah, I just think if you're bringing him back, that means the off season wasn't fully committed to improving the trenches, or they struck out in some capacity as far as upgrading significantly. Maybe they took a step forward, but not to the point that I think you're gonna. They have a shot, I think, to just really revamp the defensive line and go from one of the worst defensive lines to, with the guys that are out there, I think top 10. I mean, that might be pushing it, but this could be the type of offseason where you just see a team have a complete 180. And if you're bringing a guy like Brooks Reed back, they didn't do that.
that's fair. Look, if you're asking me though, who would I rather see on this Falcon team next year, Brooks Reed or Vic Beasley? I'm going Brooks Reed. I feel like Brooks Reed brings you something to, like, again,
especially with if you're talking ROI and the money that you're investing in the two guys. If that's taken into account in the equation, then yeah, I don't think you're wrong there. But
like I know Brooks Reed can do a thing. People might not value that thing pretty highly, but I know he can play special teams. I know he can stop the run. I know he throw a couple of spin moves out there and get you a couple of pressures. I don't know what Vic Beasley can do. I think he has the potential to be a good linebacker, but he can't tackle. So, he doesn't really have any pass rush moves. I know people have been talking like, well, he's played better as of late because he's been more productive. Sure. He gets some sort of, I don't know. It just, to me, he's the same old Vic Beasley that he's been all year long and been the last couple of years. I don't think anything has changed in recent weeks. He's just had a couple more splash plays that at least will get on the highlight reel. But as far as him bringing anything different to the table than what he was in week 4 or whenever, I don't see it. But that leaves Robert Alford as the player that's most likely to get cut. I'm still a big fan of Robert Alford. If it was up to me, I would bring him back. I think, he's had one down year after 2 really excellent seasons. I think that his down year is related to injury, but it is what it is. He's a player that they can free up, almost $8 million in cap space by cutting. They have a young player, waiting in the wings. I still think Oliver, I'm not as sort of, what I'm trying to say, how was it? Like, I think Oliver has a lot of potential, but I think the argument that like sort of like he's automatically going to be good next year, I still need to see a little bit more
I've never
from him.
gotten like the hype to start with. I mean, he even talked about he's basically learning a completely different technique as far as the outside press man that the Falcons asked for him, and you saw. I mean, he was going up against a great player in Devontae Adams, but you saw that he's going to take lumps. He's got a ways to go in that regard as far as jamming guys at the line of scrimmage. So, yeah, I think everyone needs to pump the brakes as far as what to expect from him. And I think it's very similar to the argument with the offensive line as far as, if you're going to try to plug a rookie in the offensive line, don't expect huge gains that first year with him. So I think it's similar with Isaiah Oliver. If they do give him the keys to that outside cornerback opposite Trufant, I don't think you're necessarily going to get better play than what you've gotten from Robert Alford this year. The hope for me, though, is, by letting a guy like Alford go, that's going to create quite a bit of cap space where you can help the the weakest part of your defense, which is the defensive line. And hopefully by getting better guys there, you get more pressure on the quarterback, and that's going to help the guys on the back end out. So, again, I said it in my article, I could go either way on Robert Alford. If they bring him back, I'm cool with it. I don't know how much then they're going to have to spend necessarily in free agency, and they're going to hope that they hit another home run in the draft with some of the D-line talent. But again, the way Dan Quinn's talking about Oliver and using him, and it seemed. I mean, they didn't bench him entirely because he played like 51 snaps in Green Bay, but it seemed like that was sort of the, we're going to get Alford out of there to have Oliver play that role. It seems like they're trying to plan for that. So that's why I think everyone, you and me both, are kind of thinking that that's the most likely one.
Yeah, no, I think, the thing with Oliver, I think he could be good. He could be great next year. The issue is, for me, I just don't want to just give him the job. Like, I think he has to earn it. And that's part of the reason why I would bring, if it was me, I would bring Alford back to basically make Oliver earn the job. But, like, I just feel like.
But why would you even cut him then if that's the case? Because again, cutting him, it's not going to really. If anything, it's going to hurt you that late in the season by cutting a player like that. So at that point, do you have him stay on as the nickel cornerback, or he's just a very expensive backup? So you'd have him hope that they would play him at nickel then. Because that's what I was hoping you'd see from him at some point this season. You'd start experimenting with that even earlier, or we didn't even see it when they did take or when they did put Oliver on the game. You either saw Oliver in Alford's place, or you saw Oliver in dime guarding tight ends and stuff. They have yet to experiment with Alford as a potential future nickelback, and that's why I think it's either you have Oliver play Alford's role, or that's pretty much the only other outcome. So
no. I mean, the issue with Alford playing nickel, at least this season, is that he's been pretty terrible in the slot when he's on the few opportunities he's had this year. We saw that against the Giants. We saw that against the Bengals when he was sort of shadowing A.J. Green and whatnot. So he's given up a ton of big plays when he's played in the slot this year. And so that's part of the reason why, everybody makes a big deal about Trufant's performance in that Bengals game. But Trufant pretty much held up pretty well for at least 3 quarters against Tyler Boyd. And then sort of, I think, personally ran out of gas in the fourth quarter. And that's
Alford was in the slot on that Bengals game? I thought it was Trufant mainly that.
No, it was Trufant mainly, but A.J. Green lines up in the slot a healthy amount. And because Alford was shadowing him when Green went into the slot, like that one big play that Green had early in the game, I can't remember how many yards it went, but that was from the slot with Alford giving up that play. So I think to me, the issue is going to be if you cut Alford, and because I feel like you need to have Oliver earn that starting spot, I think even if you cut Alford, you still kind of have to go out there and get a veteran cornerback. And maybe that's just a mid-tier free agent, some guy that you just signed to like a 1-year deal. But I feel like it kind of negates all the cap space that you're, saving. If you're saving like $8 million and then you have to go out there and sign, I have no idea who's the free agent cornerbacks this year, but like you go out there and sign somebody to like a 1-year, $3 million deal or something like that, you just kind of like, or a $4 million deal or something like that, then it's not to say that you didn't earn anything, because that's still like $4 million in cap space, but you're just kind of like, it's a lateral move basically is what you're doing, and you're saving money, but unless you're going to be aggressive, which I think we all kind of hope the Falcons will be at addressing some of those other key areas, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So, for me at least. But
what about Bloody Ray Wilson, bringing him back? I know he's not.
Look, I like Bloody Ray Wilson.
I mean, he's played pretty well in the decent
as the 5th cornerback. I don't want him as the 3rd. Like, I think ultimately what you want to get this defense back to is you want to get them back to where they were in 2016 and 2017, which is that on 3rd and 8s they can line up and play man coverage and rush the quarterback with 4 or blitz teams and basically have that flexibility back again. And I just don't think Bleedy Ray Wilson's that type of dude in man coverage.
Well, I'm not saying, but you don't think that's stiff enough competition type of veteran?
No. I think Bleedy Ray Wilson is a solid backup. That if you can beat Bleedy Ray Wilson, you can make the team. But I don't think beating him means that, oh yeah, he can start in this league.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I guess if we're judging Oliver on that and saying he's going to be complacent by saying a second round pick in year 2 gets the job. But at the same time, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's all about competition with this team too. So I'm totally cool with that.
Yeah, I'm not sitting here saying that they have to go out there and I'm looking at the free agent corners.
Yeah,
go out there and get Kareem Jackson or anything like that, but just somebody that has started games in this league and been functional as a starter at the very, I know
Darquez Denard, I think, is probably a free agent. I don't know if the Bengals will bring him back or not, but I mean, that might be a guy, former high pick, played starter snaps that you can look to. But yeah, the point you made as far as if you do that, you're not really reaping much of the benefit then from cutting Alford in the first place with that, with the cap that you would save. So yeah, that's why I can go either way on it. If they do bring Alford back to push Oliver, and maybe you try Alford in the slot one more time, but I think at the same time you got Casey on the field then that or on the team that you try to want to get snaps to. So I think at that point you're just looking at a really expensive backup. I mean, maybe some team would be willing to trade for that, but I doubt it. So it's a tough spot. I think you got to commit one way or the other, honestly. And it just seems like it's trending towards Oliver in 2019.
Yeah, no. Look, I wouldn't have a problem. I'm a cold-hearted bastard, but if we brought Alford back and wound up cutting him at the end of training camp, I don't think that would be a bad thing in the slightest. If Oliver and Casey and those guys went out there and proved it, that they are poised. If Casey has the equivalent of what he did this past training camp at the cornerback position at that nickel spot, then yeah, I would have. And if Oliver sort of shows you the growth that you're hoping to see from him, then to me, cutting Alford in August or something like that, or trading him at that point, I don't think is that big a deal. We see teams do that all the time. We don't necessarily see the Falcons do that, but for me, at least, I wouldn't have a problem doing that if I was running the show. But I want to see those guys prove it, rather than just basically just assuming, as so many people have done this year, that, oh yeah, Oliver and I think Casey has a lot of potential as a nickel cornerback, but we haven't seen him play, other than 1 or 2 preseason games. We just haven't seen it enough to basically be like, oh, that's a guy that can hold up for 16 games against, whoever the heck we're facing. He's going to have to cover guys like Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, and Larry Fitzgerald and T.Y. Hilton and those guys next year. So it's not as if he's gonna whoever plays that nickel spot is gonna have some challenges. So you're gonna have to go out there and prove it. So we'll see how the Falcons deal with this cornerback situation. I'm not necessarily keen on the team drafting a cornerback. I just don't think that's unless you're getting a stud that's
not early, but I was gonna say I think a day 3 developmental outside corner is definitely
that's fair.
That should be top of their needs there on that day. But yeah, all this talk that Greedy Williams or one of these other top corners is that surprise pick that the Falcons like to spring on us. I can't see that. I think that's very low on the possibility scale. I mean, prove me wrong, Falcons, but I just think when you have Trufant pretty much locked in for, in my opinion, the next 2 years. I know you disagreed with me on Twitter about that. I just think that $10 million is going to be tough to eat if they want to move on from him after next year. And then obviously you just drafted Oliver, so he's locked in, and you're more than likely going to bring back Brian Poole. You're going to have Casey in the mix, and who knows what they're going to do with Alford. But even if they move on with Alford, you got 4 guys there that are, I think, firmly locked in at the top 4 corners spots. I just don't see how you add a round 1 cornerback again. So I don't know.
I think you're onto it, but we'll have to see. I mean, because a lot of this we're talking, but a lot of it's going to depend on if we have a new defensive coordinator next year, because we could hire somebody who's a little bit more aggressive, and it's like I need elite corners.
I still think Dan Quinn's gonna. That would mean Dan Quinn's not there anymore, because Dan Quinn's still gonna call the shots and steer this ship on defense as far as the type of scheme and what. I think whoever he replaces him with, it's another puppet that hopefully makes better play calls in certain situations. Because again, I think they're going to be a cover 3 team that relies on 4-man pressure, and occasionally, hopefully, when everyone's healthy, like you said, they can play some man-to-man on those certain long situations and get aggressive. But I just don't see a difference in philosophies coming. So
I think that's fair. I think you're probably right. I just think there's a chance that one of those things, if this season, again, the worst case scenario where they go 4-12 and Arthur Blank is basically like your scheme, your sort of cover 3 scheme isn't working, and one of the things that we need to do is you're going to have to bring in somebody else to really.
So you're talking like Arthur Blank is this savvy football mind, though, too. Like,
no, I think Arthur Blank
is Freeman either. So
I think Arthur Blank is a dude that's I think he's very demanding when stuff goes down. I think,
but I don't think he's going to say something like, you got to change your entire coaching philosophy. What got you to this point?
No,
he's going to let Dan Quinn do his thing. He trusts, I think, the guys that he leads there, and if he goes down that way, then he goes down that way, and then you're gonna have to bring a completely new guy in with a new philosophy. But to sit here and say that he's gonna make Dan Quinn change the way he's coached football the last several years,
no, I don't think he's doing it. That's not what I mean. I'm trying to explain it. I think you could see this team hiring a defensive coordinator who has tendencies that mesh with Dan Quinn, but kind of wants to do things his own way. And that guy's going to be like, we're going to be more aggressive, we're going to be more blitz happy, and we're going to need a higher level of cornerback play than we've gotten out of this group of guys. And I feel like there could be pressure on Dan Quinn at that point as part of the whole, heads have to roll for this 4-12 team. And if, your head is not rolling, Dan Quinn, as far as you losing your job, but some of the authority that you have to sort of pull the strings of this team, like, I need you to go out there and hire the best defensive coordinator that money can buy at this point. And that's part of our sort of revamp to basically go to the fans and be like, this is going to be a dramatically different team, because the way that they were doing it in 2018, that resulted in 8 consecutive losses to close out the season. Again, all this is the hypothetical scenario, worst case fire and brimstone scenario that may or probably won't happen, but I'm just envisioning could happen, where I could see that scenario happening.
Not to get too much further down this rabbit hole, but if that's the case, what does Dan Quinn bring to the table if you're completely handing the keys over to a totally different defensive coach? I mean, from a talent acquisition standpoint, that's probably the only thing I can come up with then at that point, that it's like, why not just totally clean house if that's the intentions of upper management, is to say you need to do something totally different than you did on what's supposed to be your specialty.
Well, again, I'm not trying to sit here and say it's like totally different. I'm saying it's like the defensive coordinator.
I mean, his whole career is on the defensive side of the ball. So if that's the thing that he has to change, what's he still doing there then?
Again, I'm not saying like it's going to be this dramatic shift. What I'm saying is they hire somebody who his that guy's philosophy is, I want press man corners. I need an Aqib Talib. I want Aqib Talib, Chris Harris, and Bradley
But
Roby.
isn't that what he's? I mean, that is his philosophy, isn't it?
But I'm sitting here saying, like, because of that situation, they're going to put a little bit more emphasis on upgrading the cornerback play than most of us sitting here today think they should or will. That's all I'm sitting here saying. So part of it is not necessarily saying that this will happen. I'm just sitting here saying, like, simply saying, like, oh, well, the Falcons aren't going to target a guy like Reid Williams at the top of the draft. I could see, the scenario I'm picturing is like they're picking, 7th or 8th in the draft or whatever, and they're looking around and like the elite pass rushers are gone and Jonah Williams is gone or whatever, and they're like, well, we do kind of need cornerback help, and Greedy Williams is really good, so let's draft him, so I could see that scenario. I'm not saying it's a likely scenario. Again, I think we're, having conversations about what's going to happen in April, in December, it's just kind of just, I have no idea what's going to happen. But I'm just sitting here saying, like, it's not completely crazy to me that the Falcons' #1 pick this year could be a Greedy Williams type of player. That's all I'm saying.
I guess at that point, because again, I think a lot of this defense could be really good if the defensive line was good, and the defensive line isn't good. And so hopefully in that scenario, they spent a whole lot of money on the defensive line and it's guys that can turn that unit around, because I just think you'll still run into the same issues that even if you did bring in a good cornerback like Greedy Williams, I think the defense will still struggle. So that's why, to me, I think they have to realize what their biggest weakness is, what their biggest key to success is on that side of the football, upgrading that D-line. So if they do it in free agency and then that's what it comes to is you get a Greedy Williams, then all right, I guess I can talk myself into it like I did with Calvin Ridley. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's low on the totem pole as far as possibilities go.
I agree with that. I just, at this point in time, I'm not willing to eliminate any possibilities right now, because again, I don't know who's going to be coordinating this defense next year. I don't know who's going to be calling the plays. I think I know who's going to be the head coach, but other than that, like, I don't really know what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks, and then what sort of changes that prompts in January, because we could be talking, as we sit here and think, oh, well, there's going to be like a surprise cut or two, and that's like going to be a Brandon Fusco or something like that. But there could be some surprise moves come, Black Monday or whatever, or whenever it is, that we just didn't necessarily see happening, and that's going to change, the equation on certain things. Not saying it's likely to happen, but I'm just sitting here saying, like, I'm not going to rule out any possibilities. Basically, my thing is, the more this team continues to lose, the more likely it is that, Arthur Blank's going to just run up in that room with the axe and just start swinging, and whoever gets cut gets cut. So that's basically what I'm saying.
Fair enough.
Okay, guys, there you have it. Another long one, because we always seem to go back and forth on these.
So much for a short show, huh?
These mailbag questions, but that's a testament to you guys asking very good questions that require a lot of debate and whatnot. And if you want to send in your questions for next week's episode, where we will be talking about this Cardinals game and hopefully not talking about anybody getting fired on the ensuing Monday. But you can send in those questions using the hashtag Falcons Mailbag on Twitter. You can tweet at the show's Twitter address, which is Falcons PFC. My Twitter handle is FalcFans. Matt is Matt Karoly, Karoly. Of course, you can check out the show at ProFootballCentral.com. Make sure you subscribe to Pro Football Central's YouTube page, as well as the Falcon Central Radio Facebook page. And when you hit that subscription on YouTube, make sure you hit that bell icon so that you know when the show goes live each and every week. Matt, let the people know, when is your next part in your sort of off-season thing expected to drop?
Yeah, I'm hoping either next week or the week of, well, when's Christmas? Monday, Tuesday?
Yes, something like that. Yeah.
So probably shortly before then, at the very latest, is what I'm hoping for. Still trying to gather some names. Part 2's free agent related, so trying to gather as many names that I think will make sense potentially on the open market, and then I'll go through also all the internal Falcons free agents and who I think they should sign, or who they might sign, and possibly who they're going to sign on the open market. So that'll be at the very latest a couple of days before Christmas. So it'll consider it my Christmas gift to everyone. Hopefully everyone enjoys it. And then part 3 will come in January, dealing with some draft prospects. So that's at riseupreader.com.
There you have it, guys. We appreciate you tuning in, and we'll be back next week.